I want to show you something that is wildly misunderstood as it relates to Genesis 9:27. And in Genesis 9:27, just so that we all are on the same page, I want to give you the interpretation what Christians believe as it relates to Japheth. And so I'm using AI overview. And in AI overview, it says Christians interpret Genesis 9:27, a prophetic blessing pronounced by Noah in two primary ways, as a historical prediction regarding the geographical expansion of the descendants of Shem, Japheth, and Canaan, and as a spiritual foreshadowing of the inclusion of the Gentiles into God's covenant. Now, the subpoints here says spiritual and theological meaning according to Christian theology. Many Christians view the phrase, may he dwell in the tents of Shem, as a prophecy about the coming of Messiah. And the subpoint under that is the blessing of Shem. Shem is the ancestral line through which the knowledge of the true God was preserved, ultimately leading to the birth of Jesus Christ. Now, that's true, but that also comes with a bit of left out information. And what's left out is the fact that what they don't tell you is the lines of Shem lost the truth, which is why Moses wrote about the Tower of Babel. And if you remember at the first verse of chapter 11, Moses said that all the earth was one language and they were one people, meaning that if Noah said in verse 26 of chapter 9, blessed be the God of Shem. He didn't say that for Japheth. He didn't say that for Ham. He said that for Shem. And who's writing this? Moses is writing this, which means that this is historical information that came from God while Moses was writing this stuff on the Mount of Sinai. And so Moses lets us know that one point in time, Shem is the only one out of the other two sons who maintain the truth that Noah passed down to the three of them. Unfortunately, when we get to chapter 11, we find that all the descendants of Noah are all one. And we know that that their thinking that they have is not in the same way the thinking that Noah had as it relates to Noah's understanding of the message of God, because Noah was a preacher of righteousness. Well, all of the descendants of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, in chapter 11, and their descendants had a problem with God, and God cleared it up by dividing them all, by changing their language. That wasn't a blessing, that was a curse as a result to what they were doing at that time at the Tower of Babel. So Shem and the descendants of Shem lost the understanding of the truth. And then when you go on to read, you see that Abram did not know God, which is why God introduced himself. You can read this all throughout Genesis 9, going to Genesis chapter 11, and land on Genesis chapter 12. God took Abram to reestablish what the descendants of Noah had lost. And so, yes, Shem is the ancestral line through which the knowledge of the true God was preserved, but it was only preserved after God reestablished it in Abram. that is Abraham. Now, the other subpoint is the blessing of Japheth, enlarging Japheth and letting him dwell in the tents of Shem represents the Gentiles, that is the non-Jewish nations descended from Shem, being invited to share in the spiritual heritage and salvation of Israel. The problem with this understanding is that Japheth, or I should say, Abraham did not exist in this time where Noah was talking about this curse. Furthermore, Noah was not talking about enlarging Japheth. That's a distortion of the truth. Noah wasn't talking about enlarging Japheth. And Japheth does not represent all the nations. Japheth represents the isles of the nations. So what he says about the non-Jewish nations descended from Japheth, well, Shem had multiple descendants, and all of them were not Judah because the Israelites didn't exist. The Israelites didn't exist at that time. So this wasn't talking about an inviting of spiritual heritage and salvation. A lot of times I think Christian scholars just state things on a whim. Whatever comes to their mind that sounds good, they go with, instead of giving critical thought to the statements that are made, to understand the statements that are made. The prophetic judgment on Canaan, in the same passage, Noah decrees that Canaan, the son of Ham, who showed disrespect to Noah while he was inebriated, will be a servant to his brothers. Most modern Christian scholars strongly emphasize that this curse fell specifically on Canaan and his future descendants, not on Ham and all of his lineage. And so they are emphasizing that because conservative Christian people in the past used the curse of Canaan, applied it to Ham, and said African Americans are cursed in slavery because they are descendants of Ham, which is not the truth. We are not descendants of Ham. We are not descendants of Canaan. We are descendants of Shem, from the line of Eber, the Hebrew, and the line of Abraham that leads to the line of Jacob, that's Jacob, who is the ancestor of the Israelites. And so that's where we're from. Conservative Christianity can refuse to believe it. That's fine. Doesn't really matter what they believe, because everybody will know the truth when it's all said and done. However, this is what they believe about Genesis 9:27. And so if we go to Genesis 9:27 and we read that God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. Well, Noah is not talking about enlarging Japheth, because Japheth does not mean enlarge. And that's the problem with the understanding here. Japheth comes from the root verb patah, and patah means to deceive. Patah means to deceive. Now, the yod, which is where you get Yah, some people say J, is the prefix. It's a third masculine prefix, singular form of the verb, which means he will call, because the conjugation is hefil. or hyphil, which is the causative form of the verb. So it means he will cause a deception. Who is the he? Elohim is the he. For or to Japheth, which comes, it's the same Hebrew form as the verb that I just spoke about, Japheth. Japheth or Japheth comes from the root word patah. That's how his name is formed. You add the yod, the y, that is the prefix, letting you know that it is third masculine singular, and most likely it is a call imperfect form of the verb, which is a noun here. But nonetheless, Japheth name is he will be deceived, not enlarged. And so the deception is he shall dwell in the tents of Shem. That's the deception. The deception is he is going to take over the tents of Shem. That's what dwelling in the tents of Shem means. This same form is used in Genesis. Where is Psalms? Let me go to it. Psalm 78:55. And it's applied to the Israelites as they were taking over the land of Canaan. It says, he cast out the heathen, that is the goyim, that means nations, plural, also before them, and divided them an inheritance by line, and made the tribes of Israel to dwell in their tents. Whose tents? The goyim, the nations that were in that land, which is the Philistines, the Jebusites, and I forget the other two that makes up the whole of the Canaanites. So they were a coalition called the Canaanites, and they were of the tribe of Ham, of the seed of Ham. They were the Philistines, the Jebusites. Let's go to Genesis 10. Genesis 10 and let's see. Where does it start talking about Ham? All right. And Canaan begot Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusites, and the Amorite, and the Girgasite, and the Hivite, and the Archite, and the Sinite, and the Arvadite, and the Zemarite, and the Hamathite. And after were the families of the Canaanites spread abroad. Let's see. And the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, as thou comest to Gera, unto Gaza, as thou goest unto Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim, even unto Lasha. And so those are the Canaanites. I'm just trying to see if there's anything left here, if I left anything out. So going back, those are the Canaanites that lost the land to the Israelites. And the phrase that is used is God made the tribes of Israel to dwell in the tent, in their tents, just like God allowed the sons of Japheth to dwell in the tents of Shem. It was a mass takeover of Shem's descendants. This is not just about the Israelites. This is about Shem's descendants. You look at the modern day names of the Shem, of the descendants of Shem. You have the Hebrews, which is from Eber all the way down to Abraham, all the way to Jacob and his descendants, the Israelites. Then Armenians, and then Assyrians. The current day Iranians are not the indigenous people of the land of Assyria. The Assyrians are from Shem. They do not look like the people that you see today in modern day Iran, Iraq, Turkey, whatever. The Chaldeans, the Elamites, and down south, the Arabians. These are those in Yemen and those parts of Arabia. Those are not the indigenous people of that part of the land that was given to Shem. And so Genesis 9:27 is talking about a mass takeover of the tents of Shem. And we see that today. You can look in Israel, you can look in Palestine, you can look in Trey and Sidon, you can look in the lands of Iran, which is Assyria, parts of Iraq or Babylon were places where Shem dwelled. And Japheth, his descendants, who are his descendants? You just read Genesis chapter 10 to see who his descendants are. Starting at verse 2. Gog, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tabor, Meshach, Tyrus, Gomorrah, Ashkenaz. Y'all very familiar with that. Rephath, Togarmah, Javan, which is the Greeks, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, which is the Romans, and Dodanim. By these were the isles of the Gentiles. Not all of the Gentiles. That's a distinction. The isles of the Gentiles. All of these people, which is described as Japheth and his descendants, were going to take over the land, the tents of Shem, the places where Shem dwelt. All of the descendants of Japheth took over those areas. This is not just about the Israelites. This is about all of Shem's descendants. And like I said, Hebrews from Eber all the way down to the Israelites, Armenians, Assyrians, Assyria, or I should say the current name Iran is Assyria. And the Assyrians come from the line of Shem, not the current people who are in Iran, the indigenous people who the current Iranians took over the land. They took over the land from the indigenous people, the Assyrians, the descendant of Shem. The Chaldeans, the Elamites, and Arabians down south in the areas of Yemen and those parts of Arabia where the descendants of Shem dwelt. Genesis 9:27 is talking about the mass takeover of Shem's descendants' lands, not just the Israelites. You look at those lands today and you do not see the indigenous people in Iran, which is Assyria, in Palestine, which is also a place where God gave to the Israelites, which is why Psalm 78 is important, because it carries the same phrase as the phrase that Noah spoke in Genesis 9:27. I'll show you again. And he cast out the heathens, that is the Goyim, the nations, should be translated the nations, also before them, and divided them an inheritance by line, and made the tribes of Israel to dwell in their tents. He's talking about the coalition of the Canaanites, the descendants of the Canaanites, as well as the Philistines who were living in Gaza during that time. And so today, you don't see Israel, the true Israelites, in their land, because Japheth and his descendants is now dwelling in the tents of Shem. This is a prophecy that is still seen today. And so I just wanted to make that clear by way of video. So for those who will watch this later, what I'm telling you is that Japheth does not mean to enlarge. Enlarge does not mean enlarge. It is Japheth, which means he will cause a deception. Who is the he? God will cause a deception. Now, some may say, well, how's God causing a deception? Well, 2 Thessalonians says that God was going to cause a deception, and nobody's arguing about that. So God caused the deception for Japheth, which is the same name as the verb. So Japheth, which is Japheth in Hebrew, means he will be deceived. That's the meaning of the name Japheth. And what is the deception that he's going to accept? Thinking that he can dwell in the lands of Shem, because it's a mass takeover. The beginning of this began after Genesis chapter 11, because once God divided the sons of the descendants of Noah, and they became nations, having kingdoms and territory, that prepped the conditions for war, which is why Nimrod comes into play. The statement about Nimrod, let me just show you. Let me see here. Genesis chapter 10, and we go to Nimrod. He says he was a mighty hunter, or Gabor, which means warrior, before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty Gabor before the Lord. Why? Because he was taking over land. Nimrod is a son of Ham, whose kingdom, the beginning of his kingdom, is Babel. That is not Hamitic territory. And Erech and Akkad for the Akkadians. That is not Hamitic territory, or in the land of Shinar. These are not Hamitic territories. These are territories that Nimrod took over because he was a mighty hunter before Yahuwah. And so all of this, all of Genesis 9:27, which talks about, and you can just scratch that out of your Bible and put deception or deceive. All of this started with Nimrod, and it continued. It continued. And now you see today, none of the indigenous people are in Iran, which is ancient Assyria. None of the indigenous people are in Trey and Sidon, which was first given to Shem, and somehow the Canaanites took over that land and then became slaves. They became slaves when the Israelites took over the land after leaving from the Exodus. Psalms 78, I think it was 78:55. And so you see all of Japheth's descendants. That is Genesis chapter 10, starting at verse 2 down to verse 5. These are all the descendants that are currently in Shem's land. The lands that were given to Shem by Noah. And so that's all I have for today. I didn't want to go 25 minutes, but I did. But that's all. I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. Shalom.